Hello witches, it's Keldon. I hope you're all doing well. So, before I get into this video, I apologize if I do weird blinky things with my eyes. I just had LASIK surgery. You might notice there are no glasses on my face. That is because I'm no longer blind. I can see the world around me and it's really amazing, but my eyes are really dry and weird, so I apologize for that. Another big announcement that I want to do before I get into today's topic is Maggie of Witch and Moon and myself. We have officially launched pre-orders for the second printing of the Traditional Witches deck. If you already own the Traditional Witches deck, don't worry about it unless you want to buy a new one. This isn't like a second edition or anything. It's literally just a second printing. So if you didn't get a copy the last time we did it, now's your chance. The only thing that is different this time is that the book is a little bit better edited. So no more typos and things like that I missed during the second one. And it is open to international shipping. So I will leave a link down below to that. And you are going to want to go ahead and snatch one up before they disappear. With that being said, let's get into it. A few weeks ago, I made a question and answer video where somebody asked my thoughts on the intersection of witchcraft and politics. And I was like, oh my gosh, I have a lot to say on that topic, so I'm just going to make a whole separate video. And now here it is. Witchcraft and politics. I wrote a blog post about this, I think, last year, so I'll also leave that down below in the comments where you can read probably a more articulate version of everything I'm about to say. And in terms of articulation, I do have some notes that I'll be glancing at. This is because I want to try to stay on topic as best I can. So we'll see how that works out. This is a really contentious topic. People are really polarized, as they are in most political things. Some people are really adamant that politics has no place in witchcraft, they should be separate. Other people think that those two things go hand in hand. I happen to be in the hand-in-hand category. I think witchcraft and politics are very interconnected. When people say witchcraft shouldn't be political, isn't political, I hear that, I translate that as that person's specific witchcraft isn't political. And it is a personal choice, right? I mean, your witchcraft doesn't have to be political. And I will get into in a little bit, we'll get into like what that looks like, because I think some people, when they hear witchcraft and politics, they imagine a very specific thing in their mind, and it can look like a lot of different things. But also when I hear people say, like, you know, my witchcraft isn't political, that's great for you, but you don't speak for everyone. You don't speak for all of witchcraft. And I truly think that when you take that stance of, like, my witchcraft isn't political, that's coming from a place of privilege. Let me put a pause, because that statement in itself is bound to set people off. People get really upset when somebody maybe points out, like, oh, like, hey, like, you're privileged, or you have privilege. People tend to feel called out. I think people interpret that as, like, I'm a shit person, or like, oh, I don't have any struggles in my life. I've never had any, I've never had to work for anything in my life. And that's not the case. We all have certain areas in our lives where we experience privilege. In grad school, we had to do an exercise where we kind of broke down pieces of our identity and we put it into a pie chart. And then we colored in the different sections of the pie with two different colors, right? So let's just use red and blue, for example, right? So I would shade in categories or places in my life where I have privilege with blue, and I would have areas where I don't experience privilege, or maybe I experience oppression, in red. And so some people naturally have really blue circles, some people have really red circles, and some people have a mix, right? So if we look at me, we can break it down as like, I'm a white male, right? Those are two categories where I experience a lot of privilege. But I'm also gay and a witch, and those are areas where I'm not going to experience privilege because those are minority statuses. So we can see that, like, I have this mixed bag. So there's certain areas where I experience privilege, and there's certain places where I don't. And it's not to say that, like, I think we think of, like, the cisgendered, white, heterosexual male, right? That's somebody who's going to be experiencing a lot of privilege because they're in a lot of majority categories. But that doesn't mean that that person's never struggled or had hardships. It's just that those hardships and those struggles weren't a result of their identity. So that's what I mean by a place of privilege. If you're somebody who, because it also translates to me as, like, when you hear people say, like, I'm just not into politics, I don't pay attention to politics, that's a luxury. To me, I hear that as, like, you're somebody who doesn't have to worry about things like your fundamental human rights being taken away because you're gay or you're black or you're Muslim. So that's what I mean by that. And again, like, that's not to shit on people. It's just to point out a fact, that it's okay, I guess, if your witchcraft isn't political, but a lot of other people's witchcraft is political. And we need to make space for that. I think just the act of calling oneself a witch is a political statement. Taking on the mantle of being a witch is a way of stepping into being other or being counterculture. Witches have always been people on the outskirts of society. They are rebels. And typically, historically, you didn't want to be a witch. That was not a good thing. There were a lot of consequences that came with that, and there's still consequences that come with it today. We might not necessarily think about those consequences so much. I think in the United States, particularly, we're pretty insulated. We might face backlash, but it's certainly not what it used to be, and it's certainly not what it is in other countries of the world today, where being a witch is still a death sentence, or being accused of being a witch is still a death sentence. So taking on that label can be dangerous, but it's a way of kind of positioning yourself against the mainstream, and that's really powerful. Historically, witchcraft has always been political. It was something for the disenfranchised, for the people on the margins of society, for the oppressed. When you look through the folklore, when you look through the history, people who either were accused of being witches or confessed to being witches were typically lower class. I want to make space here just to say that there were a lot of upper class people too who were accused or confessed to being witches, and those people also played a significant political role. But we're gonna get to that in just a second. So for somebody who was a witch, witchcraft really, you can look at it as a means of survival. Classic things witches were accused of were like stealing crops, stealing milk. We can look at that as a way of obtaining food, right? When you're too poor to feed yourself, you're using your magic to get that food. Justice is another big one, right? The justice system really wasn't there for the lower class, and so they needed a means of protecting themselves, of getting justice. And that could be done through cursing and blasting and hexing. How do you do that? You sink your enemy's ships, you blight their crops, you kill important members of their family. And you can see tons of examples of this when you look into trial records. Isabel Gowdy, for example, her coven worked baneful magic against a local landowner who really would be kind of an equivalent of like a shitty landlord in today's standards. When those the higher class people get involved, right, it's usually about taking out political leaders. So I want to get into like these 3 historical examples, and the first one ties right into this idea of taking out high-ranking political leaders. So one of my favorite political witch stories revolves around the North Berwick Coven. So this was a group of witches accused and tried in 1590 in Scotland. And it all centered around a plot to take out King James VI. Essentially, the devil came to this coven and said, look, the king right now is my biggest threat. He's a threat to all of you, and we need to take him out. And so the witches hatched these different schemes to try to get rid of him. They tried sinking his ship. They tried poisoning him. And the interesting thing is that the coven was a mixture of lower class people and nobles, people in the higher class coming together to take out the king. In the blog post that I'm going to post down below, I talk about the story in depth. But second story, which is one that I think most of us are pretty familiar with, is the story of Aradia, or the Gospel of the Witches by Charles Leland. In the story, the moon goddess Diana has a daughter, Aradia, who she sends to Earth in order to teach the peasants witchcraft. And not just teach them witchcraft for shits and gigs, but to teach them how to use that witchcraft to take out their oppressors, poisoning them, cursing them, hexing them, all in order for survival. Huge example, and a lot of people take inspiration from that today. And I'm actually, again, I keep doing this, but I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in just a second. Then, kind of coming more into our modern era, in the 1950s, there's the Operation Cone of Power. This was a ritual performed by a coven of witches, including Gerald Gardner, in order to keep Hitler from invading England. You can read lots of different accounts of this ritual in different books. I'm going to recommend you read about it in this amazing book, Transformative Witchcraft by Jason Mankey. And that's not just because I have a huge bro crush on Jason Mankey, but because he does a really good job of breaking down the history of Operation Cone of Power, and kind of pulling all of the different references that you could read into one spot. So read this book, Transformative Witchcraft, Jason Mankey. But we can go even further into the present, into things like the Witches League of Public Awareness, and its different permutations. I think I have that right. There was a few different ones. There was like Witches Anti-Defamation League. I don't know. But it was started by Laurie Cabot. And it was a really big deal because witches were looking for societal acceptance, for basic rights. And they needed to get political about it. So, those are just a few brief examples. Now, I want to quickly touch on the topic of Republican witches, conservative witches. So, I'm a good old liberal Democrat, but I want to make space for Republican witches. And really, I didn't really think about that as being a thing until this year, actually, which is really sad and naive on my part. But many of you know I blog for Patheos Pagan, and we have a Facebook page where a lot of our articles get posted, and then people can comment on them. And over the last year, there's been a big increase in people commenting, really complaining about how Patheos Pagan has a left lean, or leans left, and that there's not a lot of representation for witches who are Republican or conservative. I have a lot of feelings about that, because these comments are not always very nice. And that, I mean, that extends to all political stripes. But the piece about a lack of representation, from time to time, I will go in and I will kind of act as like a moderator in the comments, like unofficially. And one thing I often suggest to people is, like, if you're feeling like your witchcraft is, or your like political ideas aren't being represented, start your own blog. Like, get out there and start putting out your ideas. Otherwise, all you're doing is posting half-baked, borderline troll comments on Facebook, and you're not really doing anything to help that lack of representation. But these comments are often really not geared towards promoting dialogue anyways. But I just wanted to kind of make a little statement in here too about if you feel like your witchcraft, I mean, in general, if you feel like your witchcraft beliefs aren't being represented, like, it would be a good thing to find a creative space where you can let other people know about your witchcraft beliefs. And same thing with politics. So I'm just going to leave that there. I have 2 books that I recommend if you're interested in the topic of witchcraft and politics. The first is Witchcraft Activism by David Salisbury. This is a really good book, and I cannot recommend it enough. David is a super awesome guy, and he really breaks down basically what it means to be an activist. And when I talked earlier about this idea of like political witchcraft having to look a certain way, this book really does away with it, because it breaks down all the different levels of being an activist. Being political, being an activist, doesn't mean you have to be out there on the front lines of every protest. There are so many different ways of doing the work. And we all have different abilities, and different limitations. And so this book helps you kind of figure out what is the right way for you, but also how to back it up with your magic. So it's really the best of both worlds. And he's so approachable. He doesn't, there's no like shame or kind of condescending language in this book. He's just so encouraging. So if you're looking for a really awesome book to introduce you, even just to activism in general, like I seriously recommend this book. The second book is The New Aradia, A Witch's Handbook to Magical Resistance, edited by Laura Tempest Ackroff. This is a really awesome little book, and it is basically an anthology with different essays and spells and rituals and all kinds of cool things written by different witches, all based around being a political witch and how to engage in magical resistance. I'm a little bit biased because I have an article in here about creating a witch bottle for community, family, home protection, specifically against things that come in the form of oppression, all the different phobias and isms, all of that. It's a super, super helpful book, and there's lots of really great ideas in here. So I want to touch real quick also on the concept of the new Aradia. So this is a concept that was created by Tempest and also Storm Fairy-Wolf. It was this idea that, you know, like in the Italian lore, there was Aradia, and I think the story goes, I just heard this story again the other day, basically that somebody made this comment about, like, you know, we need Aradia, and I think it was Storm commented, like, we are Aradia, and Tempest kind of took that and ran with it and created this idea of the new Aradia. And if you get this book, or if you go to her website, which I will also leave a link below, you can read, she wrote this really beautiful chart of the new Aradia. And it's so good, you guys. Like every time I read it, I'm just like, I just feel so empowered. There are also lots of other books out there on the market right now about political witchcraft. So there's a lot of resources out there. But yeah, this might have been really rambly, which I feel like I say at the end of all my videos, but I hope it was helpful. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them below in the comments. Yeah, and until next time, take care.